Hi again, everyone. This is Mark Movsesian. I'm the director of the Mattone Center for Law and Religion at St. John's, and this is another episode of Legal Spirits, our podcast series in cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on our website, which is lawandreligionforum.org, and also on streaming platforms like Apple iTunes and Spotify and YouTube. If you like our episodes, I encourage you to subscribe so that you can be alerted as new material becomes available. Well, this is going to be the last Legal Spirits podcast for 2024. We're recording this in December 2024 around Christmas time. And I think this is actually a very appropriate Christmas time podcast because we're going to talk today about C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. So C.S. Lewis, who died in 1963, was a scholar of medieval English literature at Oxford University and Cambridge University. He's much better known, I think, for his popular works, including a series of children's books, The Chronicles of Narnia, which is often read around this time of year, especially The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Lewis is also an important Christian apologist. In fact, he's arguably the most important Christian apologist in the English language in the 20th century, with important works like Mere Christianity, which we'll talk about today, but also the Screwtape Letters and The Weight of Glory, other books too. His books have influenced Christians in many communions. I think especially it's fair to say evangelicals in the United States. It's not as widely known, but Lewis also wrote a bit about natural law, what he called the law of human nature, or the Tao. His writings on that subject are quite thoughtful, but most American law students will get through law school without ever encountering any of them, unless they happen to have been students at Fordham Law School this semester. So we're joined on this episode by two Fordham law professors, Sean Griffith and Richard Squire, who have started a reading group at the law school on Christian literature. I should say that Sean is the T.J. Maloney Chair in Business Law, and Richard is the Alpin J. Cameron Chair in Law and also director of the Fordham Corporate Law Center. In their group this semester, Sean and Richard tackled, as I've said, mere Christianity. So I'm going to ask Sean and Richard about all this, how they come up with the idea for the reading group, what the response at the law school has been, why they chose Mere Christianity for the reading this semester, and how their students responded to C.S. Lewis, especially to the chapters in the book about natural law. So Sean and Richard, welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here.
Great. Well, thank you again. So about law school reading groups, we have a reading group here too at the Mattone Center, a student reading group. In fact, we read C.S. Lewis's Learning in Wartime a couple of years ago, but our group here at St. John's meets once a semester, and our readings don't really focus on Christianity as such. It sounds like your group at Fordham is a little bit different. So why don't you please just describe the group for us? I mean, how did you come up with this idea for Fordham Law School?
Well, this is Sean. I'll take the first crack at it. Our group is a little bit different from yours, Mark, in that we meet once a week and early in the morning, or at least early in the morning for a law student, which is 8 o'clock.
Yeah, that is commitment, Sean. Let me tell you that right now.
That's right. And the idea for the early hour came from a colleague at another school who we were chatting with, and he told me that he runs a Christian reading group and also a Bible study group, both of which met, in his case, early in the morning. And, early in the morning is a time when people don't have other commitments, usually. You're not likely to be out-competed by a competing obligation at lunchtime or whatever. And it seemed like the right time of day. And Richard and I had, just the two of us, had a Christian reading group in the past during COVID, and we had attempted to read together The City of God. And we thought this might be an opportunity to do something similar at the school and to involve the students. So it was a pleasure to do it to do the group with Richard.
Thanks, Sean. It was a pleasure to do it with you. And yeah, I think part of the impetus for this for us was that we wanted to continue kind of our two-person reading group, continue to discuss Christian classics. And we thought, well, maybe there's students and also members of our faculty and staff as well, though we primarily had students in mind, that might want to join us. And so we started the Fordham Law School Christian Reading Group, put up some posters, reserved a room to meet once a week I think we met ultimately over the course of 8 weeks. And students showed up, and one member of the staff did as well. Eventually we got up to, I think, 8 or 9 students participants, or maybe 8 or 9 participants in total was our biggest meeting, which um, may not sound like a lot, but we weren't sure anybody would show up. So for us, it felt like, big things have small beginnings. And that was completely fine with us. The decision to meet at 8 o'clock was related to another decision we made, or was motivated by a consideration that also influenced another decision, which is, should we ask the students, or should we expect them at least, to do the reading themselves ahead of time, even if it would be short readings? Mere Christianity is short and concise, and we chose it partly for that reason. And a consideration or a concern could be, well, law students especially already have lots to read. Their eyes are tired anyway. To pile more reading on them might be unrealistic. But Sean and I thought that one thing that we don't love about modern culture is the continual lowering of expectations, especially on young people. And so we thought maybe people will respond a little bit better if we had some standards, not terribly high, but you have to show up at 8 in the morning, and you should at least do the reading beforehand, in the sense that we're not going to read together in the group. We will discuss, presuming that people have already looked at that. So that was a factor that influenced our choice, and I think it worked out very well.
Mark, we did begin each reading with each session with a summary of the reading. And at the beginning, Richard and I were doing those summaries. And, we've never taught together before. And I think each of us thought that the other one talked too much, and we both were probably right. But at some point during the course of the sessions, we transitioned into inviting the students to present the summary of the book. And the students started doing the summaries of the reading at the end. So if there was someone who hadn't done the reading, they could get up to speed in the first little bit of the meeting. And it was wonderful to have the students take that over sort of midway through the book.
Well, look, it sounds like if you have 8 or 9 students who are coming at 8 o'clock in the morning, I mean, that sounds like a fantastic student turnout. And if you're actually getting them to introduce the readings, that sounds great too. What's the response been from faculty colleagues? Did anyone talk to you about this? Or Richard, you want to start?
I had maybe 2 colleagues over the semester say to me at some point, hey, I see from the posters that you're putting up that you're doing this Christian reading group. That's great. How's it going? No other faculty members showed up. We had one member of the broader staff show up, and the rest were students, as I said before. We also mentioned that we were doing this to the dean. We decided we weren't going to ask permission because we thought this is something that certainly at a Jesuit university, there should be no controversy about it, that a bunch of people would want together and talk about Christian literature. But we did notify him, and he was very supportive. And he said he hoped at some point he would come by. And so maybe he will next semester.
Sean?
Very similar experience. The dean sent a nice email, expressing his interest and his wish to attend at some point. And I had a couple of colleagues ask about it, express some level of interest. I had one colleague who asked whether we would be open to somebody from a different faith tradition attending, and I said, well, yes, of course. I mean, we're reading Christian literature, but there's no expectation that every person that comes would be a professing Christian. And it was a wonderful. He didn't come, but I think people did notice what we were doing.
Great. So, Mere Christianity, which you picked this semester, and Richard actually has already said why you picked it. You thought it was brief and I guess sort of digestible for students at 8 in the morning. This is one of C.S. Lewis's most famous apologetic works. For many people, it's kind of an introduction to Christian thought. I remember reading it and rereading it as a college student many years ago. It was originally a series of BBC radio broadcasts that Lewis did during World War II. I should say one broadcast survives, apparently. If you're interested, listeners, you can find it on the internet. And the series was meant to make a case for Christianity. Lewis said to defend it and to explain it. And the title, Mere Christianity, refers to Lewis's attempt to present Christianity in its essentials. Doctrines that the large majority of Christians from every communion have shared over the centuries, what's sometimes called the Great Tradition. Now, much of the book concerns Christian theology and ethics, but the book begins, as I guess it should, with an argument for the religious worldview generally. as opposed to the materialist worldview generally. I should say that Lewis helpfully points out that each of these views has been around since the dawn of history. It's not like the Enlightenment invented skepticism. And Lewis says that the first view, the religious worldview generally, implies a kind of natural law. But we'll get into all of that in just a moment. I want to say, actually, just generally, how did your students respond to Mere Christianity as a book?
I think they found it sort of, wonderful and easy to read. I mean, Lewis is a great writer, and he's a very vivid and down-to-earth writer. And I think that was a breath of fresh air. One of the other things that Richard and I had talked about potentially reading was, were some arguments by Aquinas, and those sorts of things might have been more dense and challenging. But Lewis is so down to earth. Is it feels like someone you're chatting with over coffee. As you said, Mark, it was a radio presentation at the beginning, and I think they found that him very approachable.
Richard?
My sense of what the students were getting out of this, at least this particular group, was not so much a intellectual discussion that made them question or deepen their faith. I think that did happen. I don't want to discount that. As it turned out, my sense, and I think Sean shared the sense, was that all of the students who did show up came from Christian backgrounds. There were, I think, some people from Catholic backgrounds, some from Protestants, but because we chose Mere Christianity, because it has, and Mark, as you said, kind of the essentials, they all found that the essentials that Lewis was focusing on, the elements, spoke to them. And I think they primarily just felt good that they were discussing or hearing discussed in their law school community the basics of their faith. They attend a nominally Christian Jesuit university, but you could walk around Fordham Law School and never know that it's Christian. There are no statues of saints. There are no murals of the crucifixion. There are no crosses hanging in the classrooms. It's very secular looking. And nothing religious is ever discussed in the university, as far as I know, at least. No, I've never heard it discussed in classes. It's not part of our curriculum. We don't have priests teaching any courses. And so I think these students felt like Christianity was part of their worldview to a greater or lesser extent. It was part of their cultural tradition. They expected to be able to relate the law to what they had learned, the secular law that they learned in law school, to their Christian faith, or at least their moral systems. And they found that it wasn't happening anywhere else. And this was an opportunity for them to do that. So their comments were often simply appreciative and noting kind of the meaning of things that Lewis was arguing and presenting in terms of arguments and ways of characterizing the tenets of the faith. They would relate those to their own lives and maybe sometimes to what they were learning in class.
Well, it sounds like they were getting a lot out of it, in fact. I mean, it sounds like this was actually a really great service. I mean, Sean, did you want to add anything about that?
No, I would say that, one of the questions that you asked, Mark, was what were our goals in doing it? And the way in which Richard described the secular appearance, outward appearance, and the sorts of conversations that happen at the school, I think that we just wanted to show our faith to people, right? To our students, to our colleagues, and make ourselves not available to them as believers, not as teachers, not as instructors, but just as believers, professors who believe in this particular in the school, sort of just to show our light. And I don't know if this is the right time to do this, but at the end of the term, one of the students sent a note to both of us, and I'd just like to read a section of it. And it was an expression of thanks for initiating and hosting the group. And then the student writes, "There was a period after I joined the law school, wondering if I was going to be alone in my faith, and I was afraid that it would be taken away by the world. But now I know I have comrades who are so smart and successful and yet hold the same beliefs. Thank you for doing the work of the gospel and being the light and salt of the world." And for me, the goal was just that. It was just to show to hold up belief and interest in Christianity and religion more generally to, I think, students who are just accustomed to secular assumptions, and to make ourselves available to them in whatever way they might need us.
Yeah, that's really very interesting. And our reading group here is not like that. And I'm just wondering as I listen to you whether maybe we should do something like this at St. John's too. That is to say, not necessarily an empirical sort of reading group, but something that is in a way more, I don't want to say devotional. It wasn't a prayer group you were leading really, but something that is more focused on Christian faith and more, I would guess, espousing of Christian faith. That's something to think about. So let's talk about mere Christianity more specifically now. So, or actually, let me talk about the natural law arguments in mere Christianity more specifically. So Lewis begins the book with a defense of natural law. And I think the implication is that he thinks this is where a defense of Christianity begins. He sometimes refers to natural law as the law of human nature, or the law of right and wrong behavior, or sometimes he says the moral law. I said before, he calls it the Tao sometimes too, especially in another book, The Abolition of Man, which might be something you want to do in your reading group too. And Lewis says that this law is essentially the same across different cultures, with some differences in the details. He says this is known to every person intuitively and violated continually by every person. So it's very much like St. Paul. We know the law, but we just cannot comply with it. And he says that view of law is different from another conception of law, which says law is just a human convention. And I think it's fair to say that that second view is very powerful in the legal academy today. Law is just an invention. It's just a consensus thing. In fact, it's an invention or a convention which serves the powerful. And here, of course, I'm talking about various critical theories. There's nothing behind law but power and interest. So that, I think, is the view that's often given in law schools. And I wonder what your students made. I should say also, of course, Lewis rejects that second view, and he says it's incoherent. He says even progressives don't believe that because they criticize the law as unjust. And if law was just a convention, then to say it's unjust is meaningless anyway. So, but I wonder what your students made of this, because I suspect that this idea of the natural law that he is talking about is not something they will have heard before in law school. So I don't know who wants to go first. Sean, why don't you go first this time?
Oh, thanks, Mark. Well, I agree with you that the way into the argument is the I think he says something like man is the only animal that quarrels, and quarreling. The fact that you're quarreling with someone else means that that you're trying to persuade someone, and therefore there's a background sense of right and wrong, and that gets us to the law of nature. In the book, Lewis takes on the law is all convention sort of from a nihilistic perspective. When I think about this, the alternatives to natural law, I sort of think there are two. So one is that there's no natural law and everything is power, right? So I think of like Nietzsche and like nihilism and complete relativism. But there seems like there's a intermediate step. And as you said, Mark, Lewis confronts and rejects that perspective in the book itself. But there's another step in there, which is something like the social contract, or law is artificial in a way. It's something that we would all agree to, and somehow or sometime we all agreed to it, either in fact when we met together in a legislature or in a constitutional convention, or in theory ex ante behind the veil of ignorance. And we would, and so whatever we would have agreed to rationally at that time, that's what the law really is, and that's our sense of morality. I think that the students, I don't know, and I mean, it would be interesting to hear the students on this. We didn't address this issue directly, but we addressed it with them indirectly. But I think that the students come at law school from a social contract perspective, much more than a sort of a nihilistic power, law is just power perspective. I think that the mythology that the students have in their minds, or that maybe we as a people have in our minds, is the mythology of the social contract. And so the alternative that Lewis is offering us is not a social contract argument. And I think I think that it's more alien to them as a non-social contract argument than it is alien to them as a sort of a non-critical theory, critical power type argument.
That's interesting. And, I think you and I talked about this earlier offline, Sean. I mean, social contract is very important for Americans. Probably it's less important for Brits. And in fact, just so that listeners understand, C.S. Lewis doesn't talk about social contract theory at all in this book. But it is interesting, of course, that's what Americans default to. Richard, did you want to add anything?
Yes, I was a little more hopeful that we would get more conversation out of the students on this question of the natural law. And although Lewis didn't use the term conscience, I think that it is something that he implicitly has in mind, that all of us have a conscience. And a fully developed, I think, Christian conscience, traditionally understood, would have a set of rules in it that are not just a handful. They're numerous, and sometimes they can be a little bit in tension with each other, which is why virtue consists in balance between different concerns. Like on the one hand, there is the concern not to harm other people, but then on the other hand, there is including making them uncomfortable. But on the other hand, there would be a concern about the group indicating to certain individuals that their behavior is antisocial or immoral or sinful, and so they should bend their ways. And that kind of richness and complexity he implies in his, and alludes to some extent, Mere Christianity. I feel like students, when they come in to law school now and what they encounter in the law school, what's reinforced is a very basic kind of moral law that really only has maybe two rules in it. One is that there are oppressed and minority groups, and they generally should be favored in the allocation of rights and in the allocation of property. And then the other thing is that you shouldn't make people feel uncomfortable or judge them about their sexual choices. Like, that's basically it. Those things are things that people will quarrel about, and they won't look behind those to ask, well, is that just an assertion on your part of a preference? They will assume, no, that really is a kind of moral law that we all agree on. Lewis goes beyond those things and makes suggestions about how we have an obligation to work, and we have personal property that other people shouldn't take away. And then the richest one in the book, in terms of just the number of pages he devotes to, is sexual morality. He talks a lot about how divorce is a sin, how you should, if you marry, you should marry for life, and it's a commitment, and it's not just a feeling that you have. And if your feelings change, therefore you can leave your spouse. He also refers to homosexuality as an unnatural act, and this is why we condemn it. We read through these chapters. Sean and I tried to get some discussions going on them, and this is kind of natural law, maybe, or the Christian articulation of a more fully developed, perhaps, kind of natural law, in the sense that it touches on more aspects of human life and human choices than the students are normally getting. And they were reluctant to say much at all on these subjects. They kind of sat there quietly. It may be because they disagree, for example, with Lewis on homosexuality or on divorce. It may be because they agree to some extent, but they didn't want to be judged by their fellow students sitting there. And so I think this is a place where we introduced uncomfortable topics, and that, I think, is a good thing. But we didn't get a robust engagement with them. And that, I think, is something that I'm not sure we could have expected it or not, but it does, I think, reflect kind of the age that we're in and the generations that these students are coming from, where still the notion of not being judgmental, especially in sexual matters, is paramount. And so they would rather keep quiet than say something that might offend somebody who is sitting with them in the reading group.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I should say, I'm sure listeners know this. I mean, Lewis himself later, after this, did go on to marry a divorced woman. And so when I was reading the stuff about divorce, I was reflecting on that. Now, he never comes right out and says, you cannot divorce, period. He says this is something like a drastic surgical operation. And so I don't know if he was already thinking about marrying Joy at this point or whether that came later. But for people who are listening and thinking, well, what a hypocrite he must have been because he's, condemning divorce and then he later married someone who's divorced. I think he says that, it should be very, very disfavored. And maybe he did have a change of heart later about this. I'm not sure. He also says, he talks about, let me follow up on what you were saying, Richard. He says, really, the moral law has three related concerns. One concern is our conduct towards other people, avoiding harm towards others. The second part of the moral law is about our inner condition, avoiding harm to ourselves. And the third part of the moral law is the purpose or the end goal of life, he says. And he says, modern people, this actually fits sort of with what you're saying, Richard. He says, modern people, and again, I'm editing here, but I should say, he doesn't use the word, but he means liberals, basically. And in this part of the book, he is basically doing a critique of liberalism. It's the sort of thing we hear now a lot from writers like Patrick Deneen, for example. It sounds very, very similar. He says, modern people sort of are okay with the first concern, avoiding harm to others. But he said, there's a problem with the next two, especially number 3, when we start talking about the end goal of life, ultimate questions about the universe. He says modern people don't want to talk about that at all because there's no consensus on that. He says there's consensus on the first one. I'm not even sure that's true any longer, but he says there's consensus on the first point about, what would harm other people, don't harm other people. But he says when we get into questions 2 and 3, we just stop talking because we just don't have consensus anymore. And he gives this example. He said, if the end goal of life, which is concern number 3, if the end goal of life is to serve the God who creates me, then he says, I'll have a very different understanding of my duty to myself and even my duty towards others than if I think the goal is different from that, or if I think really there's no end goal at all. And as I read this part of the book, I was thinking of the current debate in the UK over assisted suicide, which is something I don't think C.S. Lewis could ever have imagined the British Parliament adopting. So Lewis says all this, and then he says, okay, I'm just going to assume the Christian view with respect to concern number 3, and then I'm just going to go on from there. I chuckled at that too. Maybe that's unfair because, look, his book is about mere Christianity. It's not about mere something else. And so he just takes that and goes with it. But let me ask again the question. I guess I'll start with you, Sean. What did your students make of all of this? Were they shocked by this? Were they persuaded? Did they think that he's right, or that we just don't have consensus on these broader issues anymore, and so therefore we just can't talk about them? Sean, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I think that the idea of the sort of weak tea social consensus that Richard was outlining, as that is the moral set of beliefs. I think that many students, I don't want to speak for any particular students, but that a lot of our students have, right? That there's sort of a baseline moral consensus, which is essentially not hurting anyone's feelings, and so a real desire to avoid any sort of a conversation about your point number 2 and point number 3. I really think that goes to some version of a social contract theory. I mean, what's frustrating to me is that students very often don't want to probe the foundations of those sorts of assumptions and ask themselves why they hold those beliefs in the way that they hold them, or why they should follow that sort of a belief. And to go back to Lewis, that Lewis is using the law of nature to get us into the need for religion, right? Because once we acknowledge a natural law, the second thing that we acknowledge is that we fall short of it, and because we fall short of it, we're sort of under judgment, right? We need help, right? And that's sort of that gets us into talking about what Christianity offers under those circumstances. If people don't feel themselves under judgment for falling short on a set of virtues or commands, they really don't get to that second step. They're just sort of like weakly tolerating other people and their sort of wishes, and they never get to the point where they feel that they're falling short in some way, and they need something else, and that religion offers. So I appreciate what you said, Mark, where he doesn't feel like he has to confront social contract, because that wasn't the principal problem in the time that he was writing the book. If he were to come back and rewrite the book, I feel like he would need to confront social contract theory.
Yeah, I mean, he also might need to confront sort of pop psychology, because pop psychology, basically, as I understand it, is sort of like pop psychology is the wrong way to put it. I think there is a sense that well, we don't need help, in fact, and we're not doing things terribly wrong. And if we are, it's a matter of therapy. It's not a matter of judgment. And he does talk a bit about psychotherapy. He says it's good for identifying the problems, but you have to move on from that. So, I mean, that's an interesting perspective too. Yes, Richard.
Mark, I just wanted to say that I really like that part of the book that you put your finger on about kind of the 3 aspects of morality. And Lewis uses what I think is an extremely powerful metaphor. to describe how it works. He says, imagine a society is like a fleet of ships, and we want the fleet to be successful. And so what does success mean? Well, one thing, it means that the ships aren't deliberately colliding with each other, that it's not a game of of ramming each other, or deliberately harming or boarding each other. But if you want ships not to collide with each other at sea, it's not just that they can't intentionally seek to ram each other and harm each other, but also that each ship has to remain ship shape. And this is taking care of yourself, because if you lose control of your sail or your rudder or whatever, you may drift into other ships or become a hazard to navigation, even if you're not trying to do so. So we have a moral obligation to take care of ourselves, our health and our virtue, so that we're not a hazard to others. And then the third part is the fleet needs a destination. And if it doesn't have a common destination, then the ships will collide, because some will be trying to go east and others will be trying to go west. And I just love that metaphor, that way of thinking about the aspects of morality. And I push the students to talk about it. And I ask them most specifically, do you feel like Fordham Law School gives you a destination? Is it telling you this is where all the ships of the fleet should be headed? And what's interesting is that if you look at the statements of purpose of universities and colleges, going back to, in the American tradition, the 18th century, and the 19th century, you'll see these very elaborate statements where a university would have a hope that it would be training Christian men to be leaders in their society and moral exemplars and contributors to knowledge and wisdom, and to build Christian families. I mean, there's a kind of a very specific description of what we're trying to do, how we're trying to mold people at a university. And there was no doubt that there was this city, and many of its features were described. And the university said, this is what we're trying to train everybody to steer his boat, his ship toward. And of course, we don't have statements like that anymore at universities. At least I don't see that. We certainly don't. When I joined Fordham, I didn't sign on to anything like that. And our students, when pressed on this question, what do you feel like Fordham is there a general message about where should we all be steering toward? Where should we point your bow at? They thought about it for a while. Then in the next class or the next meeting, the week later, they had to think about it. They came back and one or two said, I feel like here at Fordham, we are encouraged to serve others. Service of others is an important message we're getting here. And that's kind of where we're supposed to point the ships. And I thought, that's a pretty good thing. I mean, I'm all for service to others, but it's pretty under-elaborated. It's pretty vague. There's a lot of different visions of what it means to serve others. Are you helping people to achieve salvation, to save their souls? Or are you just trying to create kind of a socialist, comfortable utopia where everybody's physically and materially comfortable, there's not too much inequality? That kind of is left for each student, I think, to work out on his own or her own.
Well, that's exactly what C.S. Lewis is saying in this book. He is saying that we just don't have consensus on things other than very basic ideas. And as far as I said before, this is kind of, although Lewis doesn't talk about it this way, he is taking down liberalism in this part of the book, because I think of liberalism as, well, the ships just keep sailing around and around, and there is no place to go particularly. I mean, that there is a kind of basic neutrality, at least when it comes to the state. That the state is not directing us towards, the convoy is not going anyplace. The convoy is just sailing around, and that's very pleasant. And that is, I think, one of the big criticisms of liberalism. Sean, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, there's a section in there. Oh, I can't remember exactly where it is, where Lewis is describing what it might be like to live under a Christian social order, and he describes something in there to displease everyone. So he says something like, it would be very left in some ways, some of the ways that Richard was describing, right? There would be sort of sharing, there would be a lot of sharing of property and things like that. So that'll upset some people on the right. And then it'll be also, with regard to personal conduct, somewhat on the right, which will upset some people on the left. And so there's a sense where there's something in there to be challenging for every person. When our students had to confront the question of whether, how they think about these things, they did, there is this sort of idea of social justice in the Jesuit tradition. and at Fordham, and so they certainly feel that. But as Richard was saying, that turns into all sorts of different things for different people. They are law students, so there was one interesting legal point that was made by a student. So one of the things that Lewis says is one of the requirements of justice, for example, is that we keep our promises and that we not break promises. But the student was in a first-year contracts class, and the instructor in that class was teaching about efficient breach, and this idea that it might be socially beneficial to allow some breaches of promises. And then this was a challenge. The student brought this as a challenge into our group, and that turned into a fruitful and fun sort of discussion.
That's fantastic. Of course, now I think the efficient breach people would say, well, we're not in fact letting you out of your promise. We're saying you've got to pay for breaking your promise, but we're not going to force you to do exactly what you promised. But that is great. That's a great thing that your student brought that up. Richard?
On what it is that the state is supposed to be doing in our society, I think there is a potentially more optimistic, although some could say it's a naive view, that the state is not in a plural society, a pluralistic society like America. The state is something just like a traffic cop, and it's creating a space in which individuals can form their own fleets and sail in different directions. So we don't have to have a common view. We just have to be able to coexist so that my fleet can sail one way and your fleet can sail another way, and we won't collide. And so the state there is just to kind of provide the rules of the road. And I think that our students also have some sense of that. Now, I do think that eventually the state does have to decide, and I think our government certainly does privilege certain destinations over others. And it does suggest that there are certain destinations that are favored and are superior. But I think that there, nonetheless, in the background at least, there are many people who still hope that we can get back to this notion of a pluralistic society in which there are multiple fleets that are coexisting and moving peacefully past each other. And this reminds me a little bit of something that maybe Sean and I were able to accomplish with this group, which is just to show the Christian students at Fordham that there are other boats at Fordham trying to sail in their direction. I think they easily could have thought that they were kind of a fleet of one, and they were set out, at least when they were at Fordham, they were isolated. And so we're putting together a little armada of our own in a way by organizing.
Well, Richard, I think that's a great way to sum up what you've done in this reading group for the semester, and probably a good place for us to stop. Maybe we'll have you come back and talk about this some more when you do some more readings with your students. But for now, let me say that's it for this episode of Legal Spirits, which is our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on our website, also on streaming platforms and YouTube. And please do subscribe if you like the content so you can be alerted when new material becomes available. But for now, let me say to Sean and Richard, Merry Christmas to you both. Thank you so much for coming to Legal Spirits.
Thanks, Mark. Merry Christmas to you.
Merry Christmas, Mark. Thanks very much. I had a great time. Would be happy to come back.
Wonderful. And Merry Christmas to all the listeners, and we'll see you in the next year.